Should you buy the new Ryzen 9 9950X from AMD? In this video, we are going to find out. My name is Matt, I'm a former rocket scientist, and my goal is to help you make the right component choices and put them together the right way every single time. In the UpcFC series, we've been helping you make the right choice by pitting two components against each other in the PC octagon to see who wins. In this video, our focus will be on the two flagship CPUs, with the newly released AMD Ryzen 9 9950X in the red corner, taking on the Intel Core i9-14900K in the blue corner. In addition to showing you benchmarks across 17 games, I will also show you how to best configure these high core count processors to generate an optimum gaming experience. And if you stick around, I will share with you my pro tips for how to unleash the performance locked inside the new 9950X, something you will definitely not want to miss. It's really not rocket science, so before the main event gets started, let's jump straight into how to best configure these chips for gaming. The two flagship chips from AMD and Intel are stacked with CPU cores. They both have 32 threads, however the Ryzen 9 9950X has 16 traditional cores, while the Intel Core i9-14900K takes a hybrid approach, with 8 performance cores and 16 efficiency cores. These high core counts mean that both chips crush professional workloads that scale well with number of cores. But what about gaming? To properly answer this, we first need to talk a little about the basics of a CPU. A CPU core is a complete independent processor. So, for example, a quad-core CPU effectively has 4 CPUs in it. Today, the term CPU usually refers to the entire CPU package, and core refers to the number of independent processors within that package. The term thread that I mentioned earlier, short for thread of execution, is simply an ordered set of instructions that the CPU processes. If you only have a single CPU core that can process a single thread, then the operating system has to rapidly rotate out which thread the CPU is currently working on. However, if you have multiple CPU cores, you can process multiple threads in parallel, offering true multitasking capability. In addition, multiple CPU cores makes it possible for an application to split itself into multiple threads to more evenly share the load. Tasks such as 3D rendering can be almost perfectly split between as many cores as there is available. But for video games, this split can be a little more challenging. Modern game engines can leverage multiple threads, however, 1 or 2 cores will typically be much more heavily loaded than the others. This chart from AMD illustrates how a game's workload might be spread out in a modern DX12 game. The main core at the top does most of the work, with each core down the line doing progressively less work and carrying less of the total load. Eventually, you might even get to the point where some cores don't participate at all and end up sitting idle. In the discussion of CPU cores and threads, we should also take a moment to talk about hyperthreading. This is Intel's brand name for a technique known as symmetrical multithreading, or SMT, but is often used to describe all SMT regardless of CPU brand. With SMT, each physical core presents as 2 logical cores to the operating system, and each logical core can handle 2 threads at the same time. The total amount of CPU compute available in each core remains the same, but it ensures that the CPU is used more efficiently. When it comes to multi-threaded games, a quad-core CPU with SMT won't perform as well as an 8-core CPU without it. Now, it's interesting to note that Intel is moving away from hyperthreading with their new Core Ultra processors. So how many cores do gamers really need? The popularity of consoles impacts how most modern games are developed and how they will scale on PCs. Both the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series consoles have 8 physical CPU cores. It therefore follows that games developed to run on these consoles would be optimized to take advantage of 8 cores. Unfortunately, most games on PC are multi-platform releases, so while you could get away with a 4-core CPU, a modern CPU with at least 6 cores is preferred, with 8 cores being ideal. Any more than that will likely be overkill unless you're running a lot of background applications that require extra processing power. So are high-end CPUs with more than 8 cores bad for gaming? The best way to answer that question is to run some benchmarks and find out. I selected 5 popular titles to test: Total War Warhammer 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Microsoft Flight Simulator, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, and Black Myth Wukong. In order to answer the question, I had to first figure out how to best configure each CPU. What's interesting with the two flagship CPUs from AMD and Intel is that they are both designed with a primary 8-core package. The 9950X has 2 8-core 16-thread core complex dies, or CCDs, whereas the 14900K has 8 performance cores with 16 threads. So to test if the additional cores are bad for gaming, we can simply disable them. For the 9950X, that means forcing games to use the first CCD, while for the 14900K, that means disabling the E-cores, thereby leaving each CPU with just 8 cores and 16 threads to run the game. For the 9950X, you can force a game to use the first CCD by pressing Ctrl-Alt-Delete and then opening the task manager. Once in Task Manager, you need to find the game executable file, which for Total War Warhammer 3 is called warhammer3.exe, and right-click on it. Then select Set Affinity. In the Processor Affinity window that pops up, you need to untick CPUs 31 down to 16, which is CCD1, while leaving CPUs 0 to 15 ticked, which is CCD0. You can then run the game, and the game engine will only assign tasks to the selected processors, which now corresponds to the first CCD only. The results are somewhat mixed. For Total War Warhammer 3 and Cyberpunk 2077, there is a significant performance benefit in the average and 1% lows at 1080p, but that diminishes at higher resolutions, with 4K showing better 1% lows at stock conditions. For Microsoft Flight Simulator and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, the benchmarks show a meaningful benefit at all resolutions and game settings if we just use one CCD. However, for Black Myth Wukong, there does not appear to be any meaningful difference between using one or both CCDs. So based on these results, there is definitely some benefit to using only one CCD, but not in all games and not at all resolutions. For the 14900K, you can disable the E-cores in BIOS. For an ASUS motherboard, you can go into the Advanced menu and select CPU configuration. You can then scroll down to the Active Efficient Cores and change it from all to 0. Save and exit, and when you boot into Windows, your system will just be using the 8 performance cores. As was the case with the 9950X, the results are also somewhat mixed. For Total War Warhammer 3, there is a significant benefit in 1% lows at all resolutions, but only a relatively small boost in average FPS at 1080p. For Cyberpunk 2077, there was actually a decrease in 1% lows at all resolutions with the E-cores off, whereas for Microsoft Flight Simulator and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, there was a decrease in performance with the E-cores off at all resolutions. However, for Black Myth Wukong, there was a small benefit to turning the E-cores off for both the 1% lows and average FPS at all resolutions. So again, there is some benefit to turning the E-cores off, but only in a few games. So what should you do if you own a flagship CPU? Unfortunately, the only way to really know which configuration to use is to benchmark your games at the resolutions and game settings that you use. It's time consuming, but it's the only way to really know which option is better. I did this for my entire benchmark suite, and as you can see, the performance was generally better for the 9950X in most games when you assigned affinity to CCD0. However, for the 14900K, the performance was generally better when you left the CPU in its stock conditions with the E-cores on. This makes sense if you're an enthusiast and just gaming, but if you're multitasking while gaming or just an average user, then shutting down cores simply doesn't make much sense. It's too much effort for too little reward. As mentioned earlier, the battle today is between the two flagship CPUs, with the newly released AMD Ryzen 9 9950X in the red corner, taking on the Intel Core i9-14900K in the blue corner. The test systems being used to run the benchmarks are my AMD and Intel Open Bench tables with the following components. For the AMD test platform, for the motherboard we have a Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master. For RAM, we have G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo RGB 32GB of DDR5 6000 at CL32. For the GPU, we have an Asus ROG Strix GeForce RTX 4090 OC Edition. For the CPU cooler, we have an EVGA CLCX 360mm AIO. For storage, we have a 2TB SK Hynix Platinum P41 NVMe Gen 4 M.2 SSD. And for the PSU, we have an Asus ROG Thor 1200W Platinum 2 power supply. For the Intel test platform, for the motherboard, we have an Asus ROG Strix Z790E Gaming Wi-Fi 2. For the RAM, we have Team T-Force Delta RGB 32GB of DDR5 7200 at CL34. For the GPU, we have an Asus ROG Strix GeForce RTX 4090 OC Edition. For the CPU cooler, we have an Asus ROG Ryzen 2 360mm AIO. For storage, we have 2TB SK Hynix Platinum P41 NVMe Gen 4 M.2 SSD. And for the PSU, we have an EVGA Supernova 1200P2 1200W Platinum power supply. Affiliate links for all of these components are listed in the description below. All testing was performed with the RTX 4090 at default clocks. The memory for the 9950X was set to Expo, while the memory for the 14900K was set to XMP. To remove bias from the benchmarks, it's important to test both systems at their optimum memory conditions. For the Ryzen 9 9950X, I decided to stick with 6000 megatransfers per second RAM, primarily because this is the memory speed recommended by AMD and is therefore what most users purchase. For Intel LGA 1700, performance increases with memory speed. However, memory stability becomes an issue at higher speeds, especially with 4DIMM motherboards, and is highly dependent on the quality of the CPU Integrated Memory Controller, or IMC. So to avoid producing results that only a handful of lucky users will be able to achieve, I selected a memory speed of 7200 megatransfers per second for the 14900K. I also ran each CPU at their optimum configuration for each game, as well as applying a number of performance enhancing tweaks, which will be covered in more detail later in the video. In order to thoroughly test the CPUs, I ran the benchmarks at different game settings in addition to different resolutions. To place maximum load on each CPU, I tested at 1080p with low settings, which should allow me to extract max performance from each chip. To create a more balanced CPU-GPU load, I tested at 1440p with medium settings. And to see if each CPU had any impact on GPU performance, I tested at 4K with ultra settings. These resolution setting combinations align well with typical gamer selections, with 1440p medium settings reflecting what most online first-person shooter gamers would likely use to achieve maximum frame rates, whereas 4K ultra settings reflect what most single-player gamers would do with a high-end CPU-GPU combination to extract maximum quality. With the CPUs ready to go, let's check the benchmarks. But before we do, I think it's only appropriate to introduce this the right way. Over to you, Bruce.
And now, it's time! Introducing the components fighting for Blackbird PC Tech benchmark supremacy. In the blue corner, we have the champion. In the red corner, we have the challenger. Who will win this battle royale? Stay tuned to find out.
As you can see from the benchmarks, the 9950X performed extremely well relative to the 14900K. So the question that I'm sure many of you are asking is, how do you unlock this performance? As with my previous videos on the 9000 series chips, there are a few important BIOS tweaks that you will need to make in order to unlock the true potential of the 9950X. The first is to enable an all-core undervolt using the curve optimizer option in BIOS. Under settings, select AMD overclocking, click on accept, and then click on Precision Boost Overdrive. In Precision Boost Overdrive, select Advanced and then click on Curve Optimizer. For my 9950X, unlike my 9900X, I selected the per CCD option, and I set a -30 CO for CCD 0 and a -20 CO for CCD 1. I did this because my CPU was unstable with an all-core curve offset of -30 for each CCD. This is a tweak that is heavily dependent on silicon quality, so I highly recommend starting at a lower value for each CCD, say a -10 CO, and then checking your stability with a CPU benchmarking tool like Cinebench or OCCT. If you prefer to do this directly in Windows with Ryzen Master, then you can refer to my recent How to Undervolt a Ryzen 7 7800X3D guide, but either way the results will be the same. The second is to expand the default power limit, which by default sets the TDP to 170 watts. You can do this multiple ways, but an easy way to do this on the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master is to change the PBO limits option to motherboard, which significantly increases the power limits over default values. The only issue with doing this is that your CPU package temps will routinely go above 90 degrees Celsius under heavy loads. So in order to keep your temperatures in check, I recommend adding a platform thermal throttle limit of 85 degrees Celsius. This will reduce your performance slightly, but it will help prevent excessive and potentially damaging sustained boost behavior. The third important tweak that you should make to help the 9950X take advantage of its new higher power limit is to provide an increase to the max CPU boost clock. For my 9950X, I selected a max CPU boost clock override of plus 100, which will allow the chip to boost to 5.8 GHz instead of the default 5.7 GHz. I did test higher and lower options, but this seemed to be the sweet spot for this chip in terms of performance uplift. The fourth and final tweak that I made was to optimize the memory subtimings. You can watch someone like Buildzoid on Actually Hardcore Overclocking to learn how to do this manually, but most motherboards now come with automatic memory overclocking options that usually do a decent job. For the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master that I'm using, there is an option called XMP Expo High Bandwidth Support that when enabled tightens the memory subtimings beyond XMP Expo. In addition, a bonus subtiming tweak that helps boost performance and reduce system latency is to increase the TREF or DRAM refresh interval to 65/535. This will work on any CPU and is a common tweak used by pros to help extract max performance from a system. Once you are done tweaking your system, I would highly recommend running a CPU intensive benchmark like Cinebench or OCCT and running a memory stability tool like Kahoo for 24 hours, just to make sure your system is fully stable. So in summary, the BIOS tweaks that I recommend making to extract max performance from your 9950X, in addition to turning Expo on, are: undervolt the CPU using a negative per CCD curve offset. 2. Increase the CPU power limits and set a thermal limit. 3. Increase the max CPU boost clock. And 4. Tighten the memory subtimings. The impact of these tweaks on performance is significant and are summarized in this table. I used Cinebench R24 multi-core as the benchmark, and I turned on each tweak individually so that I could show its impact on performance, starting with the smallest and ending in the largest. When implemented together, the boost in performance is over 10% while maintaining a CPU package temp of only around 86 degrees Celsius, which is impressive. A couple of points to note. The largest increase in performance came from undervolting and tweaking the memory subtimings, but in order to extract the most out of these changes, you need to increase the power limits as well. The TREF change improved performance, but also resulted in a 10% reduction in system latency from 71.2 to 64.7 nanoseconds, which is significant and makes the overall system feel snappier. So it's a tweak I would highly recommend for any CPU. For the 14900K, I used Intel default settings with DDR5 7200 memory. Most of the performance uplift for the 14900K was generated by simply using fast memory, which gave a 4% uplift over DDR5 6000. I also ran the XMP tweaked profile, which tightens the memory subtimings, as well as running a DRAM refresh interval of 65/535, as discussed earlier. I typically would have tweaked the system further, however, given the recent instability issues, I wasn't comfortable pushing the chip outside of the Intel-defined limits. Furthermore, I had to increase the DRAM VDD and VDDQ voltages from 1.4 volts to 1.41 volts to get the system stable, which is why it's important to run Kahoo after performing any memory tweaks. One interesting thing to note is that I achieved better results with the performance power profile selected versus the extreme power profile, which is somewhat counterintuitive. So if you have a Raptor Lake i9 CPU, I would check which performance profile generates better results. You may be surprised. One important point to emphasize is that the performance boost that you are able to achieve will be heavily dependent on silicon quality. There is no guarantee that your chips will be stable with these tweaks. That said, I chose not to push each chip further to make sure that this tweak guide will be applicable to as many viewers as possible. If you find that your 9950X is not stable after making these tweaks, then I would recommend backing off on the max CPU boost clock first, which should help. In this video, we pitted the two flagship CPUs against each other in the PC octagon to see who will emerge victorious, with the newly released AMD Ryzen 9 9950X in the red corner, taking on the Intel Core i9-14900K in the blue corner. The round-by-round results show a decisive victory for the 9950X over the 14900K, with 10 wins, 5 losses, and 2 draws across 17 hard-fought rounds. When you look at the performance across 16 games, the average FPS is actually quite close. However, the 9950X offers an increase in 1% lows of over 20% at every resolution, which is significant. This is an interesting result that is similar to the performance generated with the 9900X, suggesting that the 9950X will offer a much higher quality gaming experience. But why are the 9000 series CPUs generating amazing 1% low performance? If we take a deeper look at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 at 1080p minimum settings, we see a significant performance difference between the two CPUs, with the 9950X generating 37% higher average FPS and a whopping 73% higher 1% lows. To understand why this might be happening, we need to take a deeper look at the benchmark results themselves. For the 14900K, you can clearly see that the CPU is the bottleneck 99% of the time, which means that the processor performance isn't enough to keep up with the game at these settings. As I explained earlier, this is precisely what we want when testing the relative performance of CPUs. However, when we look at the in-game benchmark data for the 9950X, we see that the CPU is not fully loaded, with the GPU being the bottleneck 25% of the time. This means that the processor performance is so good that even at 1080p minimum settings, the 9950X is able to keep up with the game 25% of the time, thereby shifting the load to the GPU, which in turn results in a significant FPS boost. I tried lowering the render resolution even further, but I was unable to fully load the CPU. It's just that damn good. If we now look at professional workloads such as Blender and 7-zip, the 9950X dominates with advantages of over 25% in Blender and around 14% in 7-zip. This performance advantage is extended further when you take a look at power efficiency, with the 9950X showing just how efficient it is over the 14900K. Hopefully the new Core Ultra processors will yield a much needed improvement in efficiency for Intel when they are released. Given that gaming performance heavily favors the 9950X, what happens when we look at cost? When you add the cost of the CPU and RAM together, the 14900K 7200 combo is actually around $30 cheaper, or approximately 4% less, than a 9950X 6000 combo at the time of filming this video. If you now convert that into gaming value or FPS per dollar at 1080p, then you get a somewhat mixed result, with the 14900K offering equal value to the 9950X for average FPS, while the 9950X offers significantly better value with respect to 1% lows. It seems that the tables have now been turned on Intel as a result of the recent stability voltage issues, with Intel being forced to lower the price of their processors. It's truly fantastic to see this level of price to performance, even if it was driven by problems at Intel. If you're building a new system, I would, based on these results, strongly recommend the 9950X over the 14900K. The 9950X offers a significant increase in 1% lows, something that every gamer will notice, and offers superior performance in professional workloads, all at a much lower power and temperature. Furthermore, as a result of the flawed reviews from channels like Hardware Unboxed, the 9000 series is not selling well, so we are now seeing significant price cuts, which makes them even better value. It truly is an outstanding chip, something many reviewers still fail to understand or appreciate. The Ryzen 9 9950X ticks all of the boxes and is therefore an easy chip to recommend, especially when you also consider future platform upgradability. This means the pressure is now on Intel to deliver with its new Core Ultra processors, if it hopes to displace the 9950X at the very top of the CPU charts anytime soon. Remember, it's not rocket science, it's Lego. My goal is to help you make the right component choices and put them together the right way every single time. Thank you for watching this video in the Ultimate PC Component Fighting Championship Battle Series. If you enjoyed today's video, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes as other components battle it out in the PC Octagon. And if you would like to support the channel further, please also consider joining our new membership program, which I'm super excited about. Bye for now.